I've spent most of my adult life exploring my own passion for art, partly personal, but mainly as an art historian, concerned with what works of art might mean, how we might look at them, why they look the way they do, and what they tell us about the world in which they were made. But I'm also fascinated by what art means to other people, how they view it, what impact it's had. And so in this series, I'm going to talk to a number of creative individuals about the importance of art in their lives.
Today I'm in New York to meet one of the world's great opera singers, the American soprano Renée Fleming, whose rich voice and magisterial stage presence has lit up opera houses all over the world. Today she's going to reveal something of her taste in visual art, beginning on the Upper East Side at the Neue Gallery, a private museum devoted to German and Austrian art from the beginning of the 20th century.
Renée.
Hello.
Great to meet you.
Great to meet you.
I have to confess, I have been here once before, but it's a real secret treasure trove.
It is. It's such a beautiful house. In fact, for all of this art, everything evokes a time and a period that I really love.
So Vienna is one of the most important periods creatively or culturally for you?
Absolutely. This turn of the century period in general, and not just Vienna, but Germany, and all of the music from this period really speaks to me, and I sing it. It fits my voice very well.
This is just across the park from, I suppose, one of your musical homes, the Metropolitan Opera.
Yes.
Can you sneak off here in between rehearsals? I mean, do you use museums in that kind of way?
I don't so much in New York because I'm so scheduled, but I absolutely do that when I'm traveling. It's a respite for me. It's a real, it feeds me. It's a food for the soul in a sense, you know, and I love learning about it. It's my hobby, really, art.
Renée, this is an assault on the eyes. It's a silly question to say, why did you choose it? But we better ask you to explain why this is your choice.
I suppose it's a silly question because it's arguably such a masterpiece, and Klimt is so widely known and widely loved and recognizable. One of the things that fascinates me is how someone's language, artistic language in his case, is so immediately, one knows that that's Klimt in 1 second. If I'm exploring the music of Richard Strauss, one knows in a page, in 3 bars, that's Strauss. So it's the kind of personality that comes out in one's work that really interests me.
What about, I mean, this is a portrait. So it's a very conventional idea in art that you make a portrait, but of course he does radical things to it. But this is Adela Bloch-Bauer. She's the wife of an industrialist. She's now been turned into a kind of icon. That word's overused, but do we learn much about her from this, or is this much more about Klimt and his language?
Well, I think it's about Klimt, but wouldn't you love to be remembered in this way? I mean, we would all dream of this.
Painted in this way?
Absolutely. Obviously, in a new version of that, we'd all be so lucky to find ourselves 100 years later in a gorgeous museum loved worldwide.
Sometimes there are very interesting parallels between art and music. Sometimes I think there are lazy ones made. I'm going to throw one at you and see if you think it's lazy or interesting. But the textures of this work are incredibly rich. I mean, there's real gold in there, there's scumbled or expressive paint, there seems to be kind of a printing process that's been used as well, and there's an amazing rhythm that runs throughout the picture.
Yes.
Is it meaningful, therefore, to look at this painting as a kind of musical parallel, or do you think it absolutely is, visually, emphatically a
Well, there
portrait?
are a million parallels that could be drawn musically to this. I mean, first of all, there's the concept of motive here. There are small pieces which create a larger whole, and of course that's the building blocks of music are very often motives. But what I would connect to the music of this period is more the sense that it's a tapestry, that it's rich, that there's enormous depth in it and detail, and the music of this time was incredibly, almost decadent in its richness, and people felt late romantic music also has a kind of almost a sugary quality. I love it. It speaks to me 100%, you know, but it's fun to make those relationships, and yes, sometimes they are flimsy, but it doesn't matter. It makes us think about art, and it makes us think about again, how these artists affected each other. I love that idea of inspiration.
What about the idea that out of this extraordinary kind of miasma of gold and silky texture, that there's a face, and she emerges, and so then we start to think about the relationship between the sitter and the way she's depicted. And I was thinking, every time you go on stage, you have been painted to a certain extent, and you have to assume elaborate costumes, and sometimes not so elaborate. I'm curious about whether, looking at this, do you feel that there's a sense sometimes that the costume can overwhelm, that it's difficult for your own personality to emerge, or do the two always go hand in hand, and that's the essence of being a successful performer?
No, there's a huge danger in that, actually, on stage, that the performer and the person is completely lost in the setting. And in this case, I don't think that occurs because, yes, the eye sees so much gold and so much that shines, but because she is in complete relief, a gray almost, I think that the eye's drawn to her. But we try to do that with our performance. Less is more. It's one of the things we say all the time. I asked once someone who knew Maria Callas really well, I said, what made her so great on stage? I never saw her. Was she chewing the scenery? Was she throwing herself against the wall? You know, and he said, actually, she did nothing. She stood there very quietly. Everyone else was moving around her. So she is the one who brought focus to herself by being still. So these are the kinds of questions that we ask ourselves on stage all the time, that we wrestle with, that I think about constantly. Is this activity, or is this costume, or this wig, or this makeup enhancing my performance or taking away from it?
It's a wonderful way, actually, of now approaching this painting. I'll never see it in the same light again, because she is still, whilst all around her
exactly
is going crazy.
Yes. And even one of the things that fascinates me about this painting is her hands, the way she's holding them. And I think, what does that express? Is it a bit of anxiety? Is it? It looks uncomfortable, doesn't it?
Self-conscious, I guess.
Yes, maybe. Yeah. But a portrait makes you wonder about the person, don't you think? It makes you think, who is this person? What was her life? I do this all the time, and maybe all people who have to portray other people do this. I walk down the street and I see someone and I think, what is their life like? What do they do every day? How is their work? What is their inner life? And this makes you wonder, because her expression is relatively blank in a way. What is she thinking?
I love this idea that you project, and by definition you have to think when you see people, because it's part of the process of getting into a role. Interestingly enough, your next choice is also a portrait, so we'll perhaps do a bit of projection there. So another portrait, but this is Oskar Kokoschka, another great Viennese artist, and this is his portrait of the industrialist wife, Martha Hirsch, done in 1909. And it couldn't be further removed from Klimt's opulent portrait of Adela.
It's completely different. And portraiture interests me a great deal. I love the portrait gallery in London. I mean, everyone does, I'm sure. But the idea that she didn't care for this portrait is also so interesting to me.
Martha Hirsch, she rejected this picture. I mean, her husband commissioned it, but she rejected it, and it was actually bought by the architect Adolf Loos later. I mean, I suppose you can see why she may have done it. It's not flattering. But
well, we never met her, but we assume it's not flattering.
Well, no, you're right. What we do know is that she'd been recently married. She'd given birth to her first child. But she looks absolutely angst-ridden. You know, you were pointing to Adela Bloch-Bauer's hands. Look at her hands.
Yes, her hands are a touch frightening. Yes.
Do you get a sense, though, that perhaps Kokoschka is telling her something about herself she doesn't necessarily want to face up to?
Yes, or something about himself. I mean, sometimes in portraits, particularly of women, one sees really how the painter himself is relating to women. I mean, Picasso is the perfect example of that. You know, it's not always a happy relationship, but yeah, it makes you wonder. That's the curious thing about that, is these questions arise, and I don't know how much is known, particularly about this portrait. I mean, Kokoschka, first of all, these artists in that period were framed by wars, by incredible turbulence, and just before that, periods of enormous beauty and well, it is expressionistic. I mean, this whole period of music is called that, but of exploration and artistic collaboration, and then boom, the whole world explodes, World War I. So it's fascinating to kind of contemplate what was happening, what was going on in his mind. This portrait could have been done last week.
Absolutely.
It's very modern.
No, I agree.
You know,
It seems timeless.
And today we would be thrilled to have it, any of us. I mean, because it would be so interesting. But I can well understand 100 years ago why she said, I'd rather see myself in a photograph, or, you know, who knows.
So when you're assuming a stage role, do you, in a sense, step outside of yourself? Do you sometimes see yourself from afar playing these roles?
Well, it's interesting. Even when I'm discussing what I'm doing on stage, instead of saying, do I cross over here? Do I feel this? Do I feel that? I always say, does she cross? Does she feel this? How is she behaving in the scene? I automatically am separate. And it helps me a lot, because I learned this as a young singer. I was so shy and so and kind of inhibited that until I was able to completely remove myself from the process of being another person, I couldn't do it. I was still Renee. So the minute I discovered that total separation, it became much easier for me.
Renée, when you're looking at the arts in Vienna at the beginning of the century, of course, Freud looms large. So when I'm now going to ask you, did you assume characters when you were a child? I'm not asking you in the Freudian sense of that. Right. I'm just curious, did you role play as a child?
I think I lived in an imaginary world as a child. Being, you know, the oldest daughter of 2 high school vocal music teachers, music was a part of our everyday lives. I mean, they discussed their teaching and their students. I sang all the time. I thought all kids sang. I thought this was completely normal upbringing. And I read copiously. I never didn't have a book in my hand. So I think if I hadn't developed that imagination, that capacity for imagination, I would nowhere near be. I could have become a singer, but you wouldn't become an artist. You wouldn't become someone who can transport people. And I hope on a really good day that I can do that with the audience sometimes.
So well, certainly. But so music and literature fueled the imagination. Was there art in the house or reproductions? Did you have images?
Well, it's interesting. My mother really liked art, and she in fact, in retrospect, I realized now that she had a very artistic temperament. She would go to an art fair and buy the art of a friend. Or my parents were a little bit radical, and you know, they had the red furniture, and I thought it. I remember feeling every once in a while, her idea of fun was taking us all to a cemetery. And reading, you know, and reading the tombstones and thinking, how interesting. But she fueled my imagination as well. And I was terribly embarrassed at the time. You know, when you're a child, you don't want your parents to do anything at all that all the other parents aren't doing. You know, you want absolute normalcy. But it gave me permission, in a sense, to also be less inhibited.
I'm in New York at the Neue Gallery with the celebrated opera singer Renée Fleming, looking at a number of works of art that have enriched her life and career. So Egon Schiele, I think he's the best of the 3, but that's just a...
I love his work. I really love his work. It's just, there's something exotic about it and tortured, and we fantasize so much with this entire thing created around the tortured artist.
From a distance, I thought, is this an Egon Schiele self-portrait? Because this is how he depicts himself, but it's not. This is a painter friend of his called Carl
He doesn't look too good either, does he?
No, he doesn't, no, exactly. Well, they were students together.
Yes, okay.
So, I mean, it almost could have stepped off the set of La Boheme.
Definitely, definitely. I mean, look at his hand. I mean, that's a rather frightening appendage there.
Do you, I mean, I am a big fan of Egon Schiele, and when I was younger I actually read a book about him, but I did feel then, and I still feel now, that there's an element of self-indulgence about Schiele's angst. I mean, he's 27 when he dies, so he's an adolescent in many ways anyways. But do you ever feel that sometimes the emotions you have to portray or deal with are self-indulgent? Do you feel that there's ever an element that opera sometimes overstates the case?
Well, I would call them grand. I mean, I finally sang in an opera that had a happy ending a few years ago, and people actually were disappointed. They wrote letters. We don't come to the opera for happy endings. We come for lust, revenge. I mean, it's the really big emotions. But the other thing I think I love about Schiele's work is that it represents a sort of fringe of society, you know, the starving. Again, there's another stereotype, not just the tortured artist, but the starving artist. And, you know, it fascinates us. We all want to discover that fringe and be exposed to that fringe in a way. It feeds me, certainly, again, playing certain characters that are so far away from myself. I had a portrait done by a photographic portrait done. He said, "Stop being so middle class." And I said, I understand that perfectly. And of course, when I'm playing a character, I'm someone else entirely.
Well, it's funny because I wanted to ask about, you know, when you reach the level of success that you have done, how difficult is it to remember what it was like not to be successful, which is kind of what this image depicts, and a lot of opera deals with characters whose lives are tragic and unfulfilled.
Well, it's interesting because I have always maintained a connection to those years, to those student years, and I was a student for a long, long time. I didn't start even working until I was in my late 20s. And the idea for me is, because the voice is so fragile, 6 months from now, career could be completely finished, because it's a fragile instrument. We don't understand, a huge amount about the way it works. It can be affected by your physical health, by your emotional health, by a technical change that is unrecuperable. And I always imagined that I could live like a student again, and I might need to. So I stay connected to that in a way and hang on to that. I think it's dangerous to believe in one's success too much. I mean, my first exposure to art and was really a show of Chagall, and I was a student, and I wept. I walked through the show. I was very young, very impressionable, and there was something about the fantasy, about the just dreamy quality of his work.
And love as well. Those paintings are so much about being in love.
Yes, romantic, absolutely. And then I've had the great pleasure of not only exploring art, because I travel all over the world, and so I have access to all of these galleries and museums, and that's my joy, and it's how I relax. When I go to a gallery, if I've been under a lot of pressure, when I come out, I feel full. It's a satiation. I don't even know how to describe it. It's as if I've just had the most wonderful, soulful meal. It just feeds me.
Now, Renée's next choice is a group of paintings by one of America's greatest living artists, Chuck Close. So we've come downtown to visit his studio. But the first work we're going to look at actually isn't a painting, although it's a very familiar face. What exactly is this?
Well, this is a tapestry, and I remember the first time I came to the studio and saw one of the tapestries, I didn't know what it was. I couldn't recognize it. Somehow the detail is so extraordinary. It looked like a painting on fabric, on velvet. So it's a fun process in a way, because you basically just have an afternoon with Chuck, and as he's taking enormous Polaroid photographs, and then he sends them off to Belgium, and I think the art, the craft of tapestry making is quite ancient there.
Oh yeah.
And it's computerized at this point, and they reproduce quite extraordinarily well the Polaroid.
How is it? I mean, you've obviously, you featured on many posters, so it maybe isn't necessarily a shocking thing. But for me, standing here with your face almost larger than
Quite
your
large.
body next to you. I mean, it's an amazing
Yes.
sensation. But I wonder, how is it for you seeing your face writ large like this, or woven large?
Well,
Like
the only control I had in this process was to very nicely just tell him which Polaroids I liked and which I wasn't as thrilled with, because we took at least 20 Polaroids that day. But he absolutely chose. I mean, you know, I'm thrilled to have this. This is a real moment in time. It's a work of art, and it's a lovely image. So, and I'll remember this as a particular year, as a particular moment, and also just the collaboration with him. He's such an incredible human being. I feel privileged to count him as a friend and acquaintance. Chuck is just one of the most inspiring people I think I've ever met, ever will meet.
Well, let's compare your face, as it were, to, I mean, he makes these Polaroids, and then you can either end up as a tapestry, or you can end up as the basis of a painting. And there's two paintings here that Chuck has made from Polaroid photographs, which are extraordinary. I mean, standing
Yes.
close up, you can't quite see what they are. But
No,
you're right, it's a
that's
face.
the beauty of it. You can't tell up close that you can kind of see that that's an eye, but I don't even know if that's true. It's because I know his work. We're familiar with his work already. But it's an incredible technique that he developed. And Jean Juan, who I know, they actually, my understanding from Chuck is that they are trading portraits.
So this is a young Chinese artist,
Yes,
Zhang Huan, and they're
yes.
each doing a portrait of the other.
Exactly. So it'll be interesting to see how Jean Juan is portraying Chuck, in fact. But this whole idea of portraiture and the idea of actually people influencing each other in their work fascinates me a great deal. We were talking about motives before. We were talking about the smallest piece, and musically that would be, you know, 4 notes or that's repeated throughout a piece. And what I love too is that his greatest muse and consistent muse has been Philip Glass, who writes minimalistic music. So the way their art kind of relates is enormous, because there's a pattern here that's repeated and yet not quite repeated. So it's the same in Philip Glass's beautiful music.
That's a very interesting parallel, because you're right, Chuck has a system, doesn't he? He breaks the face or the image down into a grid and then plays within that grid. The grid is the constraint, but he can kick against the grid.
Exactly. And he also, I love the fact that he maps it out on paper, and in a sense that he sets up an entire, because he's working in such miniature, he has to start with the big picture.
But when he's making it, and as we can see, there's a self-portrait of a work in progress over there. He, by definition, is right up the canvas. He can't possibly have
Seeing a
sense of the
square
bigger
at a
picture.
time. No, he couldn't, no.
Chuck is like, is he the lone soloist? No, maybe the composer, I don't know, or the conductor, but he's certainly in control of every aspect of what he does.
It is low. I mean, when I saw the Rothko show in one of his entire groups was based on the concept of the isolation of success, that really spoke to me. And I mean, the idea that you're alone with your art, and I'm alone on stage. I mean, I may be surrounded by colleagues, but no one else is going to sing well for me. And I'm responsible for my performance in a way that is daunting year after year after year. Plus, and just like Chuck or any other artist, is that you have a public whose expectations are also getting higher with the achievement. So, and we feel that very intensely. That's another reason I love my friendships, such as the one I have with Chuck, because we can discuss these things and he understands.
When you look at extraordinary painting like this, or like an Egon Schiele, or like a Klimt, does that inspire you, or is there something daunting about seeing extraordinary achievement in another art form?
I'm not looking at paintings or art in general as a model for achievement. I'm looking to be moved. I'm looking to be touched and to know something more about what it means to be a human being. I think art and culture throughout history have pointed consistently to the best parts of us, and I'm looking for that light, you know, and that is inspiring, but it's not about a yardstick.
Renée Fleming, thank you for illuminating us. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.